This is a documentary on women and African American voting rights. Every day waking up in fear, unsure if they would be arrested for protesting, fighting for their right to vote. This was the viewpoint of those in the fight for equal and just voting rights. Over the course of history, voting rights have not been fair. This fight is something that seems to be forgotten now that everyone has the right to vote. However, it was not always so easy. There was a time where not everyone could walk into the voting booth and cast their vote. One thing to be aware of is that even if people were all for equal voting rights in the 1900s, they would likely not say anything. Getting involved emotionally was dangerous as it could result in even greater violence. This documentary will focus on the struggle for women and African Americans throughout their journey for voting rights. First, it is important to have knowledge on why women and African Americans were denied the right to vote. Both groups were inferior to white men, who were seen as the strongest of the population without any question. A woman was only viewed as useful for birthing children, cleaning the house, and cooking for her husband. And since African Americans were once slaves, they were viewed as even lesser than women. African Americans were also commonly placed in the everyday white household as a maid or a butler. While women had it bad, African Americans had it worse, and African American women had it even worse than the men. Imagine being a woman who was denied the right to vote just because she was a woman. Next, imagine being an African American who was denied the right to vote just because of their skin color. Finally, imagine being not only a woman, but a black woman, being viewed as lesser not only because you were a woman, but because you were black as well. It is so easy to forget the struggle for voting rights until diving back into history and remembering. Voting rights didn't just appear equal one day in history, they were earned through endless strife. It can be concerning to think that not even a century ago, women could not vote. If that weren't scary enough, it's only been a little over 50 years since African Americans gained their full rights to voting. Women gained their rights to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. This states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." This was an amazing feat for women across the United States after their tireless fight. While this was an amazing part of history, it was unfortunate to see African Americans still being denied the right to vote. The 19th Amendment states no denial on the account of sex, not race. While women were able to celebrate, African Americans were still left out. While there are African American women, it would logically seem as though they could vote. But unfortunately, this was not the case. The 19th Amendment meant that the United States could not deny you to vote based on gender. However, it was still technically acceptable, for lack of a better word, to deny based on race. To fully understand this movement, it is important to have knowledge of their fight for equal voting rights. Women in the early 1900s all stuck together as an empowered group to bring an end to the injustices they faced. Women are not and have never been socially unaware. They were aware of the way that they were viewed in society and knew that it was unfair. There are many important women who led the women's suffrage movement. One woman in particular who plays a very pivotal role in the voting rights movement is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton was born in November of 1815, placing her early in the timeline for the women's suffrage movement. Unfortunately, she did not live to see the equal voting rights for women, but without her, the fight would not have continued. Working with other women, such as Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott, they came up with the slogan, "Equal Rights for Women." Susan B. Anthony was such a devoted advocate for women's rights, and her fight was endless. The following famous quote from Susan B. Anthony shows her dedication to women's rights. "Oh, if I could but live another century and see the fruition of all the work for women. There is so much yet to be done." Anthony truly wanted to live to see the results of the tireless fight she and many other influential women put forth. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, one of the most influential points of the women's suffrage movement. These women started small, with a smaller group of women standing behind them. A sad point in the women's suffrage is that women were afraid to speak out against the injustices they faced daily. While this group of empowered women started small, it suddenly started to become the new normal. Once enough women joined the movement, every woman wanted to be part of it. It seemed as more people joined the movement, it wasn't as scary for women to speak out. People often look at the voting rights movement as just marching around with pickets, but it was so much more than that. Alice Paul, another famous women's suffragist, was born in 1885 and died in 1977. She was able to see the positive effects of her movement and was able to vote numerous times before she died. She was one of the most influential suffragists of her time and is attributed with the hunger strike. Women were protesting daily, and many grew tired of it. The police were ordered to start arresting women who were protesting. Alice Paul and many other women were arrested. While in holding, Alice Paul started the hunger strike. She organized this and got all the women to stand with her. When the women were given their meals, they would deny eating them. While people didn't want women to have voting rights, they didn't want them to physically harm themselves either. All the women in holding were not eating and refused it no matter what was said to them. This was a very smart tactic as it did worry people for the physical health of women. Unfortunately, this didn't gain women voting rights, although it did help. Once it was realized that these women were serious and would not eat on their own, they took matters into their own hands. These women were taken into rooms with their mouths forced open and they were force fed raw eggs through tubes. Unfortunately, these women were held down and force fed, meaning the hunger strike was not an ongoing threat. Alice Paul knew women's rights were necessary and nothing to be ashamed of. She is quoted saying, "I never doubted that equal rights was the right decision. Most reforms, most problems are complicated. But to me, there is nothing more complicated about ordinary equality." Alice Paul knew what she was doing and that equal voting rights were not too much to ask for. Her use of the word ordinary in terms of equality shows what basic right women were denied up until about a century ago. The amount of discrimination these women endured while also fighting for a very unpopular cause is truly amazing. As if women hadn't gotten it bad enough, African Americans had it worse. Something to note is that no one hated women, but people did have hatred for African Americans. Women were not degraded as African Americans were. Women married men and lived with them, even started families with them. The only reason men were biased towards women is that they didn't want women to have as many abilities as them. White women were never slaves, they were just viewed as inferior. African Americans couldn't even come into contact with white people without being ridiculed. So, while women did have it bad, African Americans had to fight harder for equal rights. It is impossible to have a conversation about the right to vote without also discussing the civil rights movement. One very famous civil rights suffragist is an African American man named Martin Luther King Jr., who was born in 1929 and assassinated in 1968. He was one of the most influential activists in history and believed in equal rights for all. Another activist in the civil rights movement was an African American woman named Rosa Parks, who was born in 1913 and died in 2005. Both King and Parks fought against racism in very influential and unique ways. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his "I Have a Dream" speech and read it at various locations. He is also quoted saying, "I have come to see more and more that one of the most decisive steps that the Negro can take is that little walk to the voting booth. That is an important step. We've got to gain the ballot, and through that gain, political power." Martin Luther King Jr. knew how important it was to gain voting rights and just how influential it could be for the United States once this happened. Rosa Parks refused to change seats on the bus when asked to because she was sitting in the front of the bus, which was designated for the white people. This sparked a huge outrage among Americans, but showed strife for African Americans. In 1965, the 15th Amendment was redesigned, stating, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." The United States could no longer deny any citizen to vote with regards to race. These were pivotal points in the American history as more people would soon join the fight. While African American women gained the right to vote at the same time as African American men, there was something very demoralizing for them to see white women gain the right to vote 45 years before them. It is unfortunate that the black and white women fought together for equal rights, and the full voting rights were technically only granted to white women. While the African American women kept fighting, they must have felt a sense of betrayal. Being a woman was already hard enough, and being a black woman was even more challenging. Having to wait 45 more years to vote just because you are an African American woman is something that is unfair and shows the injustices they face. African American men also had a hard time during the suffragist movements. Knowing that men are viewed as superior to women in society while they still have less rights than white women must have been even harder to see. African Americans were not given the fair chance to voting rights from the start. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, stating, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." What was not mentioned in the 15th Amendment were the barriers put in place to secure most African Americans could not vote. One popular tactic on state and local levels were literacy tests. Literacy tests for African Americans were designed to be purposefully harder with the goal to have them fail. This way, it looked as if the United States was giving equal opportunities to vote, even though they were not. The test was 30 questions and was to be taken in 10 minutes, and if one answer was wrong, you failed the whole test and therefore could not vote. This was unfair as it was designed to be difficult for those who are clearly unable to pass. This was one of the major issues African Americans faced in the voting rights movement. They were technically able to vote fully. However, it was nearly impossible to pass and gain your right to vote. President Lyndon Johnson is quoted saying, "This is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right in a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result." While today all American citizens have the right to vote, I believe as a country there are still several issues. It isn't hard to see that all American citizens are not always treated equally. One relevant issue women face today is the wage gap between men and women. The wage gap is a very real issue in today's society that gives men the power to feel superior. One shocking statistic is as follows: Wyoming had the largest wage gap, with women earning only 66.6 cents for every dollar men earn. Women are earning 44% less than a man with every dollar. An issue African Americans still face is racism and the bias that comes along with it. An excerpt on racism states the following: "Racism and irrational prejudice operate in a vicious cycle. Racism is among the worst of ingrained prejudices that characterize human behavior. Racism is real, very real. Be afraid, very afraid. Racism is rife in every sector of our society. This is proof that racism is in fact still alive and very real. In order to have a fully functional society, it is important to forget about difference among race, religion, culture, etc." The wage gap and racism are two factors that should have disappeared from today's society by today's day and age, however, unfortunately, are still of a great presence. Through the wage gap, men feel superior and more powerful than women, while women feel inferior and as if they are not worth as much as a man. The racism still dealt with today makes African Americans feel that they are not capable of the same things white people are. The injustices in this world reach back from the injustices dealt with not even a century ago. One pivotal point in the voting rights movement is that people of completely different races, religious views, etc., got involved in the fight. Once people recognized that skin color does not determine ability, the fight truly opened up to people of all different backgrounds. This is a very powerful point in the fight, as the governments could see people of all different backgrounds coming together. This was not only important for the people involved, but for the decision about voting rights. Once those in power see whites and blacks working together, they will feel more compelled to allow fair and just voting rights for African Americans. If the blacks and whites did not work together, there is a chance that the African American voting rights could not have come along until much later. As a country, it is time that the United States learn from its history of injustices and come together as one to promote a more efficient society. It is scary to recognize that African Americans could not vote fairly 53 years ago. The 21st century should and can be the turnaround for all issues dealing with different backgrounds of others. The positive effects of working together as a country can eliminate many of the current problems. The voting rights movement was one of the most influential movements throughout history. Thank you for watching my documentary.